So we are gonna, I think, radically switch the topic. So I will talk about structural approaches, which are also part of the overall conference topics. And as more precisely, I will talk about methodological structuralism and the two-factor framework. This is what I've been working on recently, and I want to share this with you. And I'm, of course, also excited to hear what you think. And I will, of course, go in more detail about everything in a minute, but mainly structural approaches have been proposed as a methodological approach in consciousness science by various authors and various schools, and of course, various flavors. But the basic idea is that we try to kind of like find a mapping between the structures we experience, for example, color similarities, on structures we find in the brain, and with structures in the brain, I mean something like activity structure. And I think one pressing question that comes with this is, how does this actually relate to the question of conscious awareness? Because in consciousness science, what we do is we try to manipulate conscious awareness of stimuli, and I'm asking the question how this relates to this overall structural framework. And I will argue that what I call methodological structuralism helps in understanding how conscious awareness modulates content. So starting off with structuralism, I will end up at kind of like a research proposal that relates conscious awareness to neural encoding of contents. So how are conscious awareness and neural encoding of content related? And for every good introduction in consciousness science, we of course have to mention the hard problem. So Chalmers explicitly phrased it in a way that he asked how neural structure and function could give rise to subjective qualitative consciousness. And this, I want to contrast that with the approach by Dennett, who said that the so-called hard problem of consciousness is a chimera. And he wants to put forward the hard question instead, which is, once some item or content enters consciousness, what does this cause or enable or modify? And it is in this vein that I want to present the approach of methodological structuralism. Okay, here's my brief outline. So I will first talk about consciousness science, then I will introduce what I call the two-factor view. I will discuss some evidence, and then also present some future directions. And as this also has been a prominent topic at the conference, I couldn't resist adding something about AI as well. First topic, consciousness science. So as you all know, so this has been it's just a reiteration on what we have been discussing so far very often, is that consciousness science strongly rests on this distinction between conscious and unconscious neural processing. And when we manipulate behaviorally conscious awareness, in neuroscience of consciousness, we want to see which neural factor explains this kind of difference between conscious and unconscious processing. This has been termed the neural correlates of consciousness. And we have various experimental techniques to do this. They mainly come from psychophysics. Here we have, I just put up the examples of masking, where a subsequent stimulus is able to suppress the first stimulus from reaching conscious awareness, or we have binocular rivalry, where both eyes are separately stimulated, but only the information entering one eye appears in conscious awareness, and then it fluctuates between what the input of the two eyes is. The structural approach, first and foremost, does not care about whether something has been experienced consciously or not. The structural approach tries to establish a mapping. So it's also based on the psychophysical method of constructing perceptual spaces, for example, a color space, where we can get, by behavioral studies, we can get kind of like these structures of what colors an average human being can distinguish along the lines of the dimensions of hue, saturation, and lightness. And broadly speaking, this is a kind of similarity space. So we have a structure of perceivable colors, and it has a very characteristic structure because it's very asymmetric. So the color space is asymmetric because there are interactions between the dimensions. We perceive yellow hues as lighter than blue hues, and blue hues as darker as yellow hues. So the color space gets a very clunky asymmetric form. And the goal of the structural approach is to see whether we can find this specific structure that we experience when we experience colors in the brain. And what does this mean more precisely? So one study I find very illustrative of this is by Brouwer and Higa. What they did, they simply showed people in fMRI these 8 colors. These are 8 colors from the CELA plane, 75 from the lightness plane, and they are all equally saturated and equally in lightness. And what they did is they showed these colors to participants, and then from visual cortex 4, from the fMRI voxel activation, they conducted a principal component analysis and plotted the distance relationships between the neural activity related to the stimuli onto the first principal components. And from that, they argued that roughly V4 activation similarities mirror the similarities we experience in consciousness or in perception, first and foremost. I know principal component analysis has its flaws. I think this is just a very illustrative way of doing this, but there have been other methodologies used to find structural similarities between neural activation and perception. And what we get is what I would call something like a neural correlate of color structure. So it might be that at some point we can give a neural explanation for why red appears similar to orange and dissimilar to green, because in the relevant neural system, red is coded as different from green and similar to orange. The problem with this concerning consciousness science might be how this relates to conscious awareness, because arguably we also have color experience, or we also have color perception that we don't consciously experience. So think of riding a bike and then mind wandering. You still would be able to, of course, stop at a red traffic light and go by green and everything. So we perceive colors unconsciously. And of course, there's also experimental and not only anecdotal evidence for that. I would say that by definition, structuralism, as I understand it, does not provide an answer to the hard problem. And we can discuss this. Other structuralists do have different opinions on that, and we can discuss that later. But I think that the way Dave Chalmers framed the hard problem already excludes by definition that structuralism can answer it, because if we concede that there's something qualitative and additional to a structure and we only describe structure, then the way the whole problem is set up will lead to the fact that we cannot capture this qualitative aspect. I leave it open whether one believes in the hard problem or whether one thinks at this point that this is a productive way to think about it, but thus the way it's framed, I think structuralism has a hard time to appeal to it. I think the question that is way more interesting and way more productive is to concede the fact that sometimes the structures, for example, of color experience appear in conscious awareness, and sometimes they do not. And I think it's interesting to ask how this happens. So, yeah. And I think a way to approach this is to think about what I and other people, so my colleagues and I, would frame as one-factor or two-factor explanations. And this is now very abstract, but I hope it will be more clear in a second. So that's the second part of the talk, where I will talk about what I think, what I would call the two-factor view. And I will start with the two-factor view and then talk about the one-factor view, because I think the two-factor view is more intuitive. So I think actually that many theories of consciousness are implicitly based on this two-factor framework. Two-factor just meaning that one, that the explanation of neural encoding of content is by many thought to be different than the explanation of how these contents appear in consciousness. So I would say that there is one factor that would explain how content is neurally encoded, where the structural approach is one promising avenue. It's very much in the spirit of connectionism that we look at neural system state spaces and everything. An alternative view would be a symbolic encoding, but that's not what I'm going to talk about today. And the second factor would be an explanation how this content becomes conscious. And I think this is what the classical NCCs and some theories of consciousness do provide. And I think a very good example is the approach of David Rosenthal and others, the higher order thought theory, which is a clearly two-factor explanation of how contents become conscious, because the neural encoding, I mean, he's not talking about the neural encoding, but maybe the psychological properties of contents are explained by quality space theory, which is also based on perceptual spaces. And the question when do we subjectively experience these qualities is explained by a second factor, namely the higher order thought re-representing this qualitative structure. And very crucial to David Rosenthal's approach, or to the higher order approach in general, is that there's not a big difference between unconscious qualities and conscious qualities. It's only that they are sometimes referred to by higher order awareness and sometimes not. So this is what I would call a two-factor approach. And I think in contrast, some theories are one-factor approaches, meaning that they try to give one explanation that at the same point, at the same time, explains the structure of contents and why they are experienced consciously. And I think something like this can be found in a very early formulation of the content NCC by Dave Chalmers, where he says that a neural system N is an NCC if the state of N correlates directly with states of consciousness. So we have one system that somehow accounts for consciousness, and which states structure also explains the structure of the contents of experience. Okay, now I hope you're not too confused, and you might ask yourself, okay, why is this important? And I think this chain of thought leads to the following point. It leads to the point where we might ask how closely the processing of specific contents is actually linked to them being consciously experienced. And in my personal experience, people have very different but very strong opinions, very different and strong opinions on that. So is it the case that we can explain, for example, the neural processing of color and color structure completely independent from them being consciously experienced, and that sometimes conscious experience is somehow added and then we experience whatever is there? Or is it the case that color structure is something that is constructed in conscious experience, that is not there beforehand and that is not in some sense there in the same way when we experience something else? And I think empirically that leads to the question whether there are structural differences in neural contents for conscious and unconscious experience. So as a structuralist, I assume that science in general can only give us accounts on structure in the world and in the mind and whatever. So I don't really care at this point about qualitative or metaphysical properties. And I think the question then arises whether, when we want to settle whether contents have the same properties independently of whether they appear in conscious or unconscious processing, I think a way to scientifically approach this is to ask whether there are structural differences in conscious and unconscious contents. And this brings me to the evidence section. So I want to briefly talk about psychophysics, but this is not the main point here. I just want to mention it. I think a way to approach unconscious structure is to use meta-contrast masking with priming. It's not mainly my idea. It's some empirical colleagues of mine and myself who are doing studies on this, or who recently started doing studies on this. Welcome. So the idea would be to, and what we try to do is, and what others try to do is construct something like unconscious color spaces from behavioral data. But there's conflicting evidence in psychophysics and also in the interpretation of blindsight. And for our small study, we found actually unconscious structure to be different. But I hope you can read about this in some future paper when we have written this down appropriately. I just wanted to mention that. For the rest of the talk, I want to discuss neuroscience with you. Because, as I told you, I think a promising approach to understand neural encoding of structure is that there is a structural mapping between state space similarities and perceptual similarities. However, the current methods that we use to extract something like neural activation structure, like principal component analysis or representation similarity analysis, do not work well with unconscious structures, unconsciously rendered stimuli in fMRI. So the only neuroscience technique that has been used there is decoding. So there's a bunch of studies that suggest that in content encoding areas like the sensory cortices or IT cortex, that it's possible there to, with a linear classifier, to distinguish neural patterns as to whether they amount to consciously experienced content or unconsciously experienced content. For example, there's a study by Sanchez et al. That find that classifiers that are even trained on a different modality than the one they are tested on are able to classify reliably neural patterns as unconscious or conscious. So if there is a linear classifier trained on visual cortex, trained to distinguish conscious and unconsciously related neural patterns, then you can apparently also classify all, neural patterns from auditory cortex as to whether they are conscious or unconscious. And from that, they suggest that there's something like supramodal or modality-independent activity signatures of consciousness that can be picked up by a linear classifier. And I think it's interesting now to go a step further and ask, how is it possible that a classifier can distinguish conscious and unconscious neural patterns in content encoding areas? Can we learn something about whether consciousness is functionally more related to access or attention or binding by better understanding what sets these kinds of neural patterns apart? What accounts for the systematic differences that a classifier can pick up? So the only thing decoding tells us, as I already implied, is that there is a systematic difference. But I think an interesting research question is to investigate whether the systematic difference amounts to a difference in structure of neural patterns for conscious and unconscious stimuli. What I mean with that is that if we think about a linear classifier geometrically and in the terms of state spaces, we can, like, it's just a schematic model, no data or anything. If there are two neural dimensions, be it two neurons or two latent principal components or what have you, it's just a schema. If we have two dimensions according to which we can describe neural states, then the possibility of neural states to be classified as conscious or unconscious amounts to the fact that the neural patterns related to conscious processing occupy a different state space location, so that a linear classifier can put a decision boundary between it. And in my little schematic, the conscious patterns are marked as yellow and the unconscious ones are marked as black. And one reason why a classifier could be able to distinguish conscious and unconscious neural patterns is because consciousness just elevates the overall activity. In this case, the cluster of patterns related to conscious processing just is shifted in state space. But in this schematic, the structure is just the same. So one reason why a linear classifier could maybe distinguish conscious and unconscious patterns is just because there is an overall enhancement of activity in the conscious case. But it could also be that in some sense, unconscious neural patterns are unstructured, and consciousness is something that structures patterns, that introduces relations. Or it could be that consciousness is something that enhances clustering, like has been shown in attention studies. There are some studies that suggest that what happens in attention is that the clustering in the neural state space is enhanced, so that the within-group similarity and the between-group dissimilarity are enhanced by neural activity related to attention. Okay, what are we to make out of this? So I think it's interesting to progress this research in which we ask how conscious activity, how consciousness modulates neural activity structure. And I think that theories of consciousness plausibly predict different structural modulations. So I would assume that higher order theories predict no structural difference, attention-related theories predict a clustering, access theories might somehow be modeled as selective modulation of neural patterns, and I think IIT is more closely aligned with this idea that consciousness has something to do with structuring or introducing structure in the first place. So I think this is interesting for consciousness science. This brings me back to the hard question. So Dennett phrased the hard question as once some item or content enters consciousness, what does this cause or enable or modify? And I think methodological structuralism amounts to this question with asking what happens to the structure of contents when they enter conscious awareness. And as this is a different topic, but as I believe that structural properties often determine functional properties, this, I believe, will give us a better understanding of the functional properties of consciousness. What does this have to do with AI? I have no time left, but it's only one slide. So I think we can approach the question of conscious AI also by a two-factor approach. We can ask whether AI is capable of encoding content, which is probably the case. And then we can ask as a second question whether it would be possible by an additional mechanism to modulate these contents in whatever way consciousness modulates contents in the human brain. And then we go for a circle now. We can still ask whether such a system will really be conscious, and this is the hard problem again, and I will leave it at that. That's the conclusion. So I think we can combine structural and classical approaches in consciousness science according to what I would call a two-factor interaction view, so that consciousness and content are different factors, but they interact. This raises the question how this interaction takes place. And I think this suggests further investigation of structural changes between conscious and unconscious content. And with that, I'm done. And thank you very much for your attention. This is my remarks, colleagues.